One of Britain's most iconic sports cars, the MGB was a machine that brought to the masses a model that, while somewhat understated in terms of performance, could be cheap and easy to be enjoyed, providing road-going fun and perky performance in a form that was attainable for a majority of the car-buying population. The mighty B, even after it was contorted and discontinued, seeing a life after death in the hands of dedicated enthusiasts, ensuring that there will be at least one of these humble little cars left on the road. The story of the MGB begins in the late 1950s, when the then chief engineer of MG, endeavour, was tasked to replace the company's then flagship model, the MGA, which had been launched in 1955 to replace the TF 1500 Midget, and was a crisp, beautiful machine that outsold on the export market, with 95,000 units shipped abroad, while only 5,869 cars were sold to UK owners. Problems emerged for the MGA, though, when Austin-Healey, a rival car builder held under the same umbrella group as MG called the Nuffield Organisation, following the formation of the British Motor Corporation in 1952, launched the Sprite in 1958. This car, despite its strange looks, being an instant hit among British buyers as trends moved towards smaller sports car designs. This, combined with other competitors such as the Sunbeam Alpine and the Triumph TR4A, meant that MGA sales were starting to struggle, while another fault of the MGA was its poor ride comfort, which was much improved on its rivals, who could also match the car for performance. Therefore, as part of the original specification for the replacement MGB, the new car would retain all the driver appeal of the MGA, while also adding a certain degree of comfort and accommodation, with MGB development beginning in 1958 under the codename MG EX205, and was the first MG Roadster to be fitted with a monocoque structure, whereby the chassis and body shell come down the production line together rather than the previous body-on-frame construction. As required, the car carried over many features from the previous MGA, including the brakes, while the engine, a BMC B-Series power unit as launched in 1954, was enlarged from the previous MGA's 1622cc to 1798cc in order to compensate for the heavier monocoque construction, a byproduct of which was increased torque that added to acceleration against the MGA. To solve the matter of comfort, MG trialled various methods of rear suspension, mainly comprising of coil spring arrangements, but none were deemed suitable for the car, thus leading, in desperation, to the design team bringing over the traditional arrangement of a live rear axle, sprung and located by simple leaf springs. This somewhat agricultural solution was deemed to offer the best overall compromise between cost and effectiveness, and the springing rates were much softer than the MGA's in order to achieve the comfort and civility the engineers were chasing, while the front suspension and rack and pinion steering were also carried over from the MGA, with the whole assembly being mounted on a detachable crossmember. Other creature comforts added to the MGB were wind-up windows as standard and a comfortable driver's compartment that offered generous amounts of legroom, the MGB making its debut at the 1962 London Motor Show, to which it opened to critical acclaim, reviewers noting the car's superb styling and performance that was a worthy successor to the MGA, and it was in this that MG placed as much emphasis as possible on its looks to try and get the car sold in the United States. The general consensus on the car was that MG were attempting to endear themselves towards the high-end Grand Tourer market, which was occupied by the likes of Aston Martin and Jaguar, but with a price tag that wouldn't break the bank, while performance for the original MGB was modest for the era, with a 0-60 time of 11 seconds and a top speed of 100 miles an hour. To compare, the Triumph TR4 had a 0-60 time of 16 seconds and a top speed of 100 miles an hour, while the Austin-Healey 3000 had a 0-60 time of 11 seconds and a top speed of 115 miles an hour, the MGB also having a competitive 23 mile per gallon fuel consumption, which was comparable to the 3000's 23.5 mpg and the Triumph's 22.5 mpg. Aside from production in England, the MGB was also assembled in Australia at the Enfield Press Steel factory in Sydney, with complete knockdown kits being shipped there for easy construction, followed by production moving to the BMC Zetland plant in 1968, with MGBs produced in Australia until 1972. The end of construction came due to the Australian government introducing new legislation, That, so as to enjoy favourable tariff treatment, required locally produced cars to feature at least 85% local content, of which the MGB only sported 45% local content, leading to only 9,000 Australian MGBs being produced, all of which were roadsters. Following its launch, the first few years of the MGB saw little modifications, but was subject to a continuous development plan by MG in order to ensure it remained relevant as the automotive world changed around it, with 1965 seeing the MGB engine receive the 5-bearing crank bottom end that had been introduced for the ADO-17 Landcrab saloon cars, which improved the driving experience but at the expense of marginally slowing its acceleration. In late 1965, it became apparent that, despite the MGB being a popular and successful machine, customers desired the provision of a hardtop coupe model in order to complement the pre-existing drop-top roadster, while prior to this, MGB roadsters could be made available with a removable hardtop, but this wasn't a popular alternative to a dedicated coupe design. To help develop a closed coupe version of the car, MG turned to the Italian Carrozzeria Pininfarina for design assistance, with the result being a greenhouse-style sloping rear with a large window, while most crucial was the provision of this car with a hatchback in an era when there were few dedicated hatchbacks on sale, especially among high-end GT cars like the Aston Martin DB5 and the Ferrari 365, which had to make do with somewhat cramped boots. While the closed coupe version of the MGB, designated the MGB GT, shared most of its mechanical parts with the Roadster, there were some minor alterations, with the suspension receiving different springs and anti-roll bars, and a different windscreen was installed that was designed specifically for ease of replacement and service. In terms of performance, the added weight of the new roof meant the car had a slightly slower 0-60 time than the Roadster, but the improved aerodynamics meant it had a 105 mph top speed, the MGB GT being an instant hit among critics and buyers, with the design similarities of this car's shape to high-end Grand Tours like the DB5 and the E-Type, seeing it affectionately dubbed the Baby Aston Martin. Aside from the mass-production MGBs, a limited run of specially styled MGBs were also produced by the Belgian coach builder Jacques Cunet, which altered the front-end design, fitted a fastback, and raised the height of the windscreen, the fruits of their labour being the MGB Berlinetta, a superb-looking variant of the Mighty B, of which 56 were produced. Customised MGBs were also incredibly popular on the international road competition scene, with modified aluminium-bodied examples achieving victory in the Grand Touring category for the 1965 Monte Carlo Rally, as well as seeing wins at the Guards 1,000 miles race at Brands Hatch in 1965 and the 84-hour Marathon de la Route at the Nürburgring in 1966, while also winning the GT category in the 1966 Targa Florio and the 1966 and 1967 Spa 1000. Come 1966, it was apparent that the rival Austin-Healey 3000, which had been in production since 1959 and had become one of Britain's most successful sports cars, was in need of replacement, but considerations as to developing a suitable successor for this 3-litre behemoth were slow to materialise. Originally, BMC had proposed a bespoke replacement for the car called the ADO-30 or Austin-Healey 4000, a low-slung coupe that seemed to follow many styling cues from the MGB. The ADO-30 project, despite much enthusiasm, and with a proposed 360,000 unit per annum production run, suffering a slow, expensive and protracted demise, due largely to management bungling and the merger of BMC with Jaguar to form British Motor Holdings or BMH. Having spent in excess of £1 million on the ADO-30 project and achieved very little, BMH desperately needed a quick replacement for the 3000, and thus turned their sights to their other flagship sports car model, the MGB, the designers of which, at the time, were working on their own improved variant of the car that would be fitted with a 3-litre C-Series engine from the Austin 3-litre saloon, and was dubbed Project ADO 52 or the MGC. Therefore, as the MGC project was proceeding much more successfully than the Austin-Healey 4000, BMH's management chose instead to merge the two schemes into a single model, the initial plan being to create both the MGC and an equivalent Austin-Healey model, but Donald Healey, the founder of the original Donald Healey Motor Company that helped to form the Austin-Healey joint venture in 1953, was less than enthusiastic of an Austin-Healey car being badged as an MG. Healey, therefore, put up stiff competition against the proposed MG, demanding that the 3000 remain in production, though neither he nor the BMH management could meet a compromise, and thus the Austin-Healey 3000 ended without successor in 1967, while the MGC would be fitted with a 2.9-litre straight-six engine and would adopt the crisp styling of both the MGB Roadster and the GT. The engine, producing 145 horsepower, presented a 0-60 time of 9.7 seconds, and the car would go on to a top speed of 118 miles an hour while sporting a fuel consumption of 20 miles per gallon, though problems came following the launch of the MGC in 1967, when a slew of teething and performance issues with the car were quick to make themselves apparent. The first issue was caused by the BMH press office when they incorrectly pressured the tyres of the launch cars, meaning that the heavier weight of the 3-litre engine exacerbated the car's already significant understeer, the noted heavy steering being condemned by motoring critics, which put the car in a bad light from the start. Second was the rather unsightly bonnet bulge implemented on the MGC in order to accommodate the larger engine, a last-minute solution, as no other method of enlarging the engine bay stylistically was forthcoming, while the final issue was the fact that it was neither a direct replacement for the Austin-Healey 3000, nor was it a high-performance version of the MGB, the car being marketed as a standalone model that seemed somewhat lost in BMH's product lineup. In total, only 8,999 MGCs were built by the time production ended in 1969, of which 4,457 were GTs and 4,552 were roadsters, perhaps the only distinguishing legacy of the MGC being the fact that future King Charles III took delivery of a 1967 MGC GT, which he later handed down to his son Prince William in 1997. In 1968, British Motor Holdings merged with the Leyland Group to form British Leyland, and following this, the newly formed manufacturer began a slew of facelifts and replacements to the models it had inherited, with the MGB being no exception, and in 1969 the car underwent a cosmetic overhaul, with the original chrome grille being replaced by a recessed plastic design that invoked the ire of enthusiasts. Problems didn't just emerge from within the UK, but also abroad, specifically the unprecedented rise of Japanese car builders who were suddenly posing a significant threat to British car firms, the most notable competitor to the MGB in 1969 being the Datsun 240Z, a brand new sports car from the Nissan company that sought to compete directly with the MG in its most lucrative market, the United States. The 240Z was not only a stylish car, but also presented reliability and build quality that far exceeded its European rivals, and thus became the fastest-selling sports car in American history, this being hampered further by the enactment of emissions regulations outlined by the Environmental Protection Agency through the Clean Air Act of 1963 and the Vehicle Air Pollution and Control Act of 1965, which required the management of unchecked pollution on both domestic and imported cars being sold in the United States. In response, MG detuned the B-Series engine from its original power output of 95 brake horsepower to 82 brake horsepower, increasing the 0-60 time to 18 seconds and reducing the top speed to 90 miles an hour, while behind the scenes, attempts to replace the 8-year-old MGB were dropped by British Leyland's chairman, Donald Stokes, who axed MG's EX234 project in 1968. The EX234 was a development considered as early as 1964, in which the MGB's design was to be revised in order to improve its suspension system, but this would be combined with a comprehensive styling overhaul with input provided by Pininfarina, the resulting prototype being a beautifully styled, low-slung sports car with the drive layout from an Austin Gypsy and hydroelastic suspension from the Austin 1100. With the EX234 project progressing nicely, the intention was to offer this MGB replacement with a new series of engines, including the A and B series power plants, with the possibility of the car also providing a replacement for the MG Midget. However, despite there being several working prototypes for the EX234, Donald Stokes and the British Leyland management made the short-sighted decision to stop development of the new car, as MGB and Midget sales were still strong and thus were in no need of replacement. As Stokes was the former chairman of the Leyland Group, which had previously controlled the Triumph marque, he placed a greater emphasis on the development of Triumph models in order to improve their sales, and thus oversaw the creation of cars like the Triumph Stag and the TR7, both of which were designed specifically for the American market, but ultimately failed to corner it due to a variety of mechanical and build quality issues. All the while, MG and Austin-Healey were left to languish in isolation, providing the wider British Leyland firm with a steady income on the export market in order to help pay off the company's mounting debts. But rather than providing themselves with a brand new Italian-styled sports car reminiscent of the Alfa Romeo Spider, and fitted with a variety of engines that allowed MG to rationalize their product range, the company was now stuck with near-decade-old designs that, while selling well, were queered by an inevitable sense of commercial fatigue. Thus, as British Leyland set to work on developing the ill-fated TR7, the company underwent its first major reorganization as profits began to slip under increasingly strained worker relations, with 1971 seeing the company be subdivided into Austin Morris, incorporating the two mass-production car brands, and the specialist car division, which took on the high-end Jaguar, Rover and Triumph. Behind the veil of reorganization, though, the splitting of the high-end marques and the low-end marques was a tactical move by the British Leyland management to leave Austin and Morris stagnating out of sight and out of mind, while more attention was placed into developing new models for their luxury brands, such as the aforementioned TR7, the Rover SD1, and the Jaguar XJS. The ignorance of the British Leyland management to the Austin and Morris marques, which included MG, meant that no incentive or funds were allocated to develop a much-needed replacement for the MGB, thereby forcing MG engineers and designers to consider cheaper ways of maintaining the car's appeal in the marketplace, with perhaps the most sought-after revision to the MGB being the provision of greater power, but in a better package than the MGC. To help them consider this upgraded model, MG designers turned to the world of aftermarket modifications, and had noticed the significant popularity of converting the original power plant to the superb Rover 3.5-litre V8, which was derived from the power unit fitted to large American saloons like the Buick Skylark and the Pontiac Tempest, and was among the most famous car engines ever built. After buying the license to produce UK-built examples, Rover placed the engine into a slew of their products, including the P5, the P6 and the Range Rover, while the most notable aftermarket converter for MGBs to host a Rover V8 was independent tuning engineer Ken Costello, who was able to fit new engines to these sports cars in proficient quantities. While MG's engineers had previously been skeptical of the ability to fit a Rover V8 to an MGB, Costello proved it could be done without serious modifications to the engine bay or frame, and after testing a Costello-converted example, British Leyland chose to take the concept for themselves, but without providing a single penny of royalties to Costello himself for having come up with the original idea. Sourcing Rover V8s was an easy matter now that both MG and Rover were part of the same company, but there were a few management issues that meant that the resulting car, the MGB GT V8, wasn't as superb as it could have been, starting with the fact that MG chose to downgrade the power output of the Rover V8 from Costello's 180 horsepower to a meager 137 horsepower, and while a minimum power output of 140 horsepower would have been more suitable, a 0-60 time of 7.7 seconds and a top speed of 125 miles an hour could be obtained. This was complemented by the fact that the Rover V8's aluminium cylinder block was much lighter than the iron four-cylinder fitted to the regular MGB, which meant that the handling and weight wasn't affected as much as it had been with the MGC, while the second and more crucial management issue made regarding the MGB GT V8 was the fact that no attempt was made by the company to sell the car on the American market. In the United States, the MGB and Midget were still selling in profitable numbers, so the inclusion of a range-topping high-performance model of the car would have filled the product list perfectly, but instead, British Leyland refused to rework the MGB GT V8 for the left-hand drive market, only producing 7 examples as testbeds for certification on American roads before eventually selling these cars on the European market. The decision not to sell in the United States, while never formally established by British Leyland, was likely due to the fact that the company was swiftly losing presence on the American market due to an increasingly constrained dealer network, the stringent regulations for cars being sold in America, and the influence of the fuel crisis, which struck in October 1973, the same year that the MGB GT V8 was launched. The fuel crisis would have a profound effect on the sale of V8s, both in Britain and America, as these inefficient machines were quickly superseded by economy models from Japan and Germany that swept up the market, the MGB GT V8 being no different, as despite presenting a fuel consumption of between 27 and 31 miles per gallon, the very concept of buying a V8 in the midst of an economic recession made no sense to prospective customers. The truth of the matter was that, regardless of the fuel crisis, the MGB GT V8 would have likely been a cash cow on the American market, as it was a comparatively efficient machine, akin to the ever-present Nissan 240Z, with the reality being that the MGB GT V8 was the variant this model truly deserved, providing both power and performance in a neatly styled package. Sadly, without being made available on the lucrative US market, the car didn't truly find a home in Britain or the non-US export markets, and thus began to falter in the face of larger, more practical sports cars like the Ford Capri. While as British Leyland fell into bankruptcy in 1975, the supply of Rover V8s fell drastically short of demand, and thus what units were available were placed into the upcoming Rover SD1, while the MGB GT V8 received whatever was left over. Eventually, GT V8 production quietly ended in 1976, with only 2,591 units sold, a number that should rightfully have been doubled if the car had been released in 1967 instead of the MGC, and if it had been made available in the USA, though GT V8s did find a home with the Oxfordshire Police Force, who took on several examples for use as patrol cars before replacing them with V6 Ford Capris. As for the MGB itself, British Leyland were determined to ensure that their sales in America remained strong, and thus complied wholeheartedly with every US emission and safety regulation enacted, though due to the continued indifference of the wider BL management towards the Austin Morris subdivision, redesigning the car comprehensively to suit these requirements was done on a very tight budget, with the result only serving to ruin both the car's looks and performance. From 1974, new crash impact regulations stipulated the inclusion of revised 5-mile-an-hour bumpers on production cars, and thus cash-strapped MG chose to replace the original chrome overriders with large protruding steel-reinforced black rubber bumpers, with the front bumper also incorporating the grille. That same year, impact regulations also required that car headlights be a minimum height off the ground for rear-view visibility, and since the MGB was a low-slung sports car, it failed to pass muster on this requirement, the design team being unable to revise the front end to suitably match the regulations, and instead simply raised the suspension by 1 inch, which meant the car was now horrendously prone to understeer, not helped by emissions regulations that demanded a reduction in power output from the 4-cylinder engine. The problems of poor handling wouldn't be rectified until 1977, when rear anti-roll bars were fitted in order to counteract the effects of the raised ride height, though by that same year, it was more than apparent to both customers and critics that the MGB was being kept in production solely because MG had nothing else to sell, nor did they have any money to develop a replacement. The car was very much a carryover from a bygone age, contorted by safety regulations and strangled by emissions laws, its antique design and image not helped by the rise of highly economical hatchbacks in the mid-1970s, with the likes of the Renault 5, the Volkswagen Golf, the Vauxhall Chevette and the Talbot Sunbeam, presenting power, performance and practicality that far exceeded what few archaic sports cars remained in production. MGBs continued to sell in spite of the hot hatch revolution, primarily due to their cheap price and running costs, but they made little profit, this being especially pronounced in America, where MG would ship a minimum level of units to the United States in order to supply a demand that wasn't there, with these cars sitting in stockyards and secure lots for months before being sent to showrooms. The situation in America was so desperate that British Leyland made a loss of £900 on every car sold in the US market, the final straw eventually coming during the restructuring of British Leyland by the company's new chairman, Sir Michael Edwards, who noted the fact that MG had apparently lost its identity, and that with the previous policy towards supporting the Triumph brand over MG, morale at the company's Abington factory was very low. Edwards, therefore, could conceive no future for the MG marque as part of his plan, and thus decided that the Abingdon plant would be closed, with all MG production being halted, this announcement being ill-timed, as MG had celebrated the 50th anniversary of the marque in September 1979, during which the firm highlighted the fact that worker relations, when compared to the industrial strife being wrought elsewhere in British Leyland, were fantastic by comparison. MG had always operated in the manner of a family company, with a modest workforce that proudly built and sold their machines, the 50th anniversary celebrations consisting of a week-long celebration that included the flying in of MG dealers from the company's 150 outlets across the globe, as well as a carnival on September 9th through the streets of Abingdon. Therefore, the announcement on September 10th that the Abingdon factory was to be closed hit the local area with shock, and while the workers considered the closure to be an insulting display of ingratitude, especially accounting for the good worker relations when compared to more militant British Leyland factories like Cowley and Longbridge, the closing date for the MG factory was set for June 1980, and the MG marque itself was presented with an uncertain future. In truth, Edwards would later consider the closure of Abingdon as one of his biggest regrets, especially in relation to how ending production at the site affected the local population on a sentimental level, the reality being that the failure of MG at Abingdon was years in the making, starting with the company being relegated into the Austin Morris subdivision that was kept conspicuously out of the way, and ending with the necessity to close it in order to save the ailing economics of the company. The end eventually came on October 21, 1980, when the last MGB, a roadster, rolled off the Abingdon production line, ending an assembly run of 18 years and 523,836 cars, as well as the company's factory home, while the last MG midget, which had also endured the decline of the MG marque, had drifted silently out of production just under a year earlier, on December 7, 1979. By the time the Abingdon factory closed, MG were losing an approximate £400,000 per week, a horrendous contradiction to the fact that it had once been one of British Leyland's most profitable divisions, and following the end of MGB production, British Leyland struggled to find a home for the MG brand, eventually placing the marque on a variety of tuned versions of their regular family cars, such as the Maestro, Montego and Metro. However, the enduring legacy of the MGB meant that there was a life after death for this superb timeless machine, as in October 1979, following the announcement of the Abingdon plant closure and the end of MGB production, Alan Curtis, who held a 42% stake in the Aston Martin company, entered into discussions with British Leyland as to purchasing both the MG marque and the Abingdon factory in order to create a new facelifted model of the MGB. The scheme, however, required £30 million in order to buy the Abingdon factory from British Leyland, and there was much scepticism as to where these funds would be garnered, and though an Aston Martin MGB prototype was produced, British Leyland suddenly ended the deal when they considered the MG marque too valuable to sell, choosing instead to place it on the likes of the Montego, Maestro and Metro so as to retain the rights to it. All attempts by Aston Martin to buy the MG marque subsequently ended when the company nearly went bankrupt in January 1981, though despite this, the idea of creating a new dedicated MG sports car was still on the cards, with the general theme being to create a model based largely on the ever-popular MGB as a basic but fun roadster. In 1983, the company attempted a comeback with a new MG midget based on the underpinnings of the proposed AR6 range of Austin saloon cars, but this never went beyond a few working prototypes, while in 1985, MG moved drastically to the opposite end of the spectrum with the EXE concept, a 180-mile-an-hour supercar that was built to rival the likes of the Porsche 959, but this again never went beyond one prototype. Following the end of the EXE, MG returned to the idea of a low-slung roadster design with the F16, which included pop-up headlights and a crisp body that was quintessentially 80s, while the last MG Revival concept for the decade was the DR2, a roadster design that experimented with the fitting of a larger 3.9-litre Rover V8 engine. With the exception of the F16, which would later be evolved into 1995's MGF, the midget and DR2 concepts failed to reach production due to a lack of certainty regarding the market for roadsters, with hot hatchbacks remaining the order of the day, and with the spectacular collapse of traditional sports cars in the late 1970s, it appeared that investing in roadsters was not commercially viable. This mindset was suddenly overturned in 1989, when Mazda launched the incredibly successful MX-5, this car having been directly inspired by the post-war British roadsters of the 1950s and 60s, with cars like the MGB and the Triumph Spitfire being very popular in Japan, the MX-5 being conceived as a loving tribute, with a low-slung body akin to MGs and Triumphs of the time, but with unbeatable Japanese reliability to back it up. The arrival of the MX-5 opened the floodgates, and started a trend that became a staple of the early 1990s, giving rise to numerous competitors and facsimiles, such as the Honda S2000 and the Lotus Elan M100, while during the same year as the MX-5's release, MG had committed themselves to a replacement for the F16 project, the PR3, which was gradually evolving the design towards the final MGF. However, the eventual production model that the PR3 was leading towards wouldn't be made available for at least another 4 years, and thus the company needed to create a new short-term model to answer the demands by customers for a revived MG Roadster. The result was Project Adder, which was launched in late 1989, this design being based on the highly successful MGB bodyshells being produced by British Motor Heritage to supply the restoration market. And with British Motor Heritage being owned by British Leyland's successor Rover Group, this allowed for a ready supply of MGB-style body shells for use with Project Adder, which could be cheaply assembled without distracting design efforts from other Rover Group products, such as the R16 facelift program for the Rover 200, 400 and 800. Thus, Project Adder was placed on a budget of only £5 million, and would use as many in-house parts as possible, the final product being essentially the marriage of the British Motor Heritage MGB bodyshells, modified accordingly for the 1990s, with the underpinnings and power plant of the since discontinued DR2 concept, while to further save on costs, the leaf spring rear suspension, rear drum brakes, boot lid and doors were carried over from the original MGB design. As the 3.9-litre Rover V8 was to be used in the new car, the final production name for this machine would be the MG RV8, which delivered 190 horsepower and could do 0 to 60 in 5.9 seconds, reach a top speed of 135 miles an hour, and attain a fuel consumption of 26 miles per gallon. Production consisted of 2 parts, with the bodyshell created by British Motor Heritage at the former Morris factory in Cowley, before being married to the drivetrain and chassis at the former Austin factory in Longbridge, the prestige of this model being so great that it was essentially hand-built on its own production line, away from the other Rover Group products, with the interior lined with veneered bird elm woodwork and Connolly leather. The resulting car made its appearance at the British International Motor Show in October 1992, to which it received somewhat mixed reviews, with the car's performance being praised, while the comfort, handling, practicality and economy saw less than enthusiastic feedback, with other bones of contention being the less than stellar braking caused by the rear drum brakes and rear leaf springs, while the car's price tag of £26,000, which put it in the same bracket as the rival TVR Griffith, meant it was too expensive for the customer base it was hoping to appeal to. The TVR Griffith was a far more modern car by comparison, with both an improved driving experience and motoring technology, while the MG RV8 was simply a carryover from the early 1980s, compounded further by sales in the UK and Europe being hampered by the influence of the 1992 global economic recession. While the car was seen as something of a joke in Britain, its launch at the 1993 Tokyo Motor Show was greeted with widespread acclaim, and was seen as an excellent retelling of the MGB formula, thereby seeing sales on the export market to Japan be several times greater than those for the domestic market, with 1,983 MG RV8s being eventually produced, of which 1,579 of them went to Japan, accounting for 79% of the total run. Although it could be argued the MG RV8 was a commercial failure, the reality was it served its purpose as a stopgap before the MGF was unveiled in 1995, this car, after nearly 10 years of development, causing a significant stir among the motoring press, as the first all-British car design to be launched by Rover Group since the Montego of 1984, and the return of MG to the fore was met with huge commercial success. A clear reflection of the MGF's commercial performance was that the BMW management, who took control of the Rover Group in 1994, refused to sell it on the American market, as they expected the car would be such a hit that it would steal sales away from their own upcoming Z3 Roadster, though regardless, the MGF was a simple but superb two-seat roadster that perfectly captured the quirky, eccentric charm of the post-war British roadsters from the 1950s and 60s. Ultimately, the MGB was one of the most iconic and popular sports cars of its era, garnering praise and universal appeal across all of its incarnations, even including the contorted and underdeveloped British Leyland rubber bumper models and the 90s-bred MG RV8, with each variation of the car illustrating its own individual sense of charm that could, and still can be, procured on a budget, making for truly one of Britain's most successful enthusiast cars.